Randall Carlson, thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
Doing well. Well, thanks for having me.
Well, a lot of people right now are wondering, wow, this is the moment. So, for people who are not caught up to speed, about a year ago, January of 2024, there was a letter to Ashton Forbes that was posted on YouTube. And I want to play part of that letter right now.
Let's have a listen.
Our problem. Then came you. Hi, Ashton. Impressive. This is what I want to leave you with. There was a guest on the Joe Rogan podcast that was talking about sacred geometry and some new technology his friends had discovered on some island somewhere. He did record another episode, but it never been published. Doesn't the wording sacred geometry remind you of something? If you choose to spend time on this, which I think you should instead of mall aliens, keep in mind that your case is one product of the technology. What happens on the other island, you will understand this if you pursue it, is another more rudimentary product. What if those in combination could lead you on the right path to the actual technology? The gray bearded man is the key, and he probably has no idea that he is. Finally, I want to say this. How do you defeat someone who can turn skyscrapers to dust, completely erase whole neighborhoods in an afternoon, and steal a burning Boeing 777 midair? Someone who, when needed, has the complete control of all media and crafts the perception of events and has most of humanity eating from its hands. After almost a full life in their service, I think I know the answer. You talk about them, and you don't stop talking.
Well, okay, what a way to start.
Well, yeah, what a way to start.
So let me
Well,
say this right off the bat is that the other context of that is it's a letter about what happened to that Malaysian airline flight 370, and it was praising the investigative research I had done up until that point, about 6 months of research. And it was telling me that we have this like plasma technology, and at the time I didn't know anything really about it. And after that, I watched some clips that you had gone viral, I think, on either Sean Ryan or Joe Rogan or both, and you were talking about plasma technology. And I started looking into it, and I went, "Wow, that was apparently talking about you and Malcolm Bendel." And I found Bob Greenyer talking about low energy nuclear reactions and all this stuff, and it just seemed very weird. And now we're a year later, and I'm 100% convinced it's all about plasma technology. So I want to get asked you one question right off the bat is the same question they asked me, which is, what does sacred geometry remind you of in there? Because when that question was asked to me, I went, I don't know, a donut? What does it remind you of?
well, a donut, yeah, you're talking about a torus, and a torus geometry seems to be integral to the whole operation of plasmoids because, for whatever reason, plasmoids seem to prefer a toroidal geometry. And when you have a means, and I always am reluctant to try to talk too much about this because I'm really only in the first grade level of understanding plasma science. But I've seen enough personally, firsthand, to know that it's real. Okay, so I've also seen enough to know that other people who know more about it than I do are scratching their heads trying to figure out what in the world they're witnessing. So it's not really so much a question of how does it work. It's the question is, yeah, it works. Now we're trying to figure out how it works. And what it seems is that it comes down to frequencies. Certain frequencies seem to be effective in somehow triggering this self-organization amongst a random chaotic plasma stream. Somewhere that it's in that range of things where my understanding is still relatively vague. Hopefully, if we talk again in 6 months, I'll have a clearer understanding of it. But it's in that range of phenomena where you go from an incoherent, disorganized, chaotic stream of plasma, which is just disorganized electrons and ions, And then under certain frequencies, it seems to almost assume an intelligence of its own, and it begins to cohere into these organized systems. And it seems it prefers certain ratios over others. And the other thing that it also seems is that many of those ratios are the very ratios we find embedded in the, and I'll use quotes, sacred geometry from various cultures through various epochs of history. Now, whether they were somehow utilizing those ratios in the service of plasma energy, I don't know. But it is a coincidence, if in a way, because so many of the ratios, proportions that we find within, again, I'm going to use quotes, sacred structures, right? Yeah. Sacred structures seems to have this correlation with geometry. And I mean, we can look at a few examples if you want.
We can look at them in a second here. Let me just start though with one thing. Baby steps, because I want to get to all of what you just mentioned. But what was the thing that got you to even look at plasma? It was like, what triggered you on that? Because for me, I'd never even thought about plasma. It was just like, oh, that's just something physics people look into. You know, like what got you to realize there was something more there?
Oh, well, I was interested in it from years ago. I read a book entitled, I think it was Plasma, The Fourth State of Matter. And that had to have been early 80s. So it was one of those things that kind of gestated in my mind for a long time without any proactive studies to get behind it. And then I guess we're going back about 10 years ago, and I got a call from Malcolm Bendel, who had been working on several devices that were based upon plasma energy. And basically what he told me was that he had seen a video where I was giving a lecture on sacred geometry, and the essence of it was that he found that certain geometric ratios built into the literal devices, into the machines, made it more effective in making this transformation from disorganized plasma streams into organized plasmoids. And in this video that he saw, I was giving a lecture somewhere, I don't even know where it was a lecture on sacred geometry, and I was talking about the consistent use of certain proportions throughout all of these structures through history and around the globe that generally we would define as being sacred, in the sense that they were temples or places of worship or churches, cathedrals, things like this. And I was pointing out these consistent geometries, and he contacted me to tell me that those were the same geometries he was finding effective in building these plasma machines. Wow. So at that point, I was like, okay, because in the back of my mind, I'm going, okay, I know that if you use these particular ratios and proportions in a building, in architecture, but not only in architecture, but in art and in music, in multiple realms where you're trying to manifest something within the realm of physics, the physical domain, right? So one of the things that seemed to be one of the secrets, for example, of Renaissance art, as well as many of the ancient traditions, the Greeks apparently knew this, the Egyptians definitely did. Megalithic builders seem to use it. We've even found the monumental earthwork architecture in North America, particularly the pre-Columbian stuff that disappeared not long after the Europeans arrived, all seem to be based upon the same geometric template. And it's a few basic forms, but from those forms you can get a multiplicity of variants. And so those particular forms were what he was finding seemed to be most efficacious when it came to building these devices.
So let me say that what's crazy about that is that earlier on the letter, there's a part I didn't play. It talks about how this technology is based off simple monostructures, and that basically adding to the structure then allows it to have a different function, implying that they can use it for infinite energy, teleportation, all kinds of things that we would think are magical. Now, the letter and the part that I did play also said, that Randall Carl, the graybeard man's the key, and he probably doesn't even know that he is. And I was going to ask you what he means by that, but if he's right, you probably wouldn't know. But I think you just answered it. I think you just answered it. Mm-hmm. There's something I want to tell you that might help you out, is that Einstein won the Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect, which showed that light is a photon, a packet of waves. And they did that because they shine light on metal. And when they increased the brightness, they didn't see an increase in energy from the electron. So it wasn't like a ball hitting another ball. That's not the reaction that they saw. The reaction they saw was like more balls got released, but they didn't have more energy if you increase the brightness. And instead what they found is that, okay, if they want to increase the kinetic energy, they don't change the brightness of the light. They change the color. They change the frequency of the light. And Einstein won the Nobel Prize, and ever since we've now believed that light is a particle and a wave. But it's not. Light's just a wave. And the answer to the photoelectric effect is resonance. It's frequency. It's what you just said. It's not that light's a little packet and you need to have the right size packet. It's that you need to be tuned in to the right frequency because everything is waves. And so then, if that's true, then the answer to a lot of stuff out there, including plasma, is probably sacred geometry and ratios. And that's why I want to talk to you tonight. So, first official question then is, in the context of that ancient history you were talking about, what do you think the most specific, most important geometric patterns are that you see, encoded throughout structures, nature, whatever?
Well, I think it's hard to assign a priority because each one plays a different role. Clearly, all the polygonal forms, the regular polygons, are important. We find them, in growth ratios, in crystalline structures, in this spacing, the spacing ratios of planets. I would say start with the polygons. Start with a simple square, a simple, you've got an equilateral triangle being about the simplest form that you can actually enclose space with, which would be an equilateral triangle with three edges the same length. And that's produced by a simple geometric operation that requires just laying out a circle. I should have had my implements here at hand so I could have shown you examples.
I think we understand. My followers are very familiar with the equilateral triangle formation enclosing space. Yeah, go ahead.
If you have a circle, you draw a circle, and then you draw another circle with the same radius, such that the center of the second circle falls on the circumference of the first, you get this thing. It looks like a Venn diagram. It's an overlap. And it's called the vesica piscis, or the vessel, yes. And its length to width ratio is in the square root of 3 to 1. And that's a very interesting ratio. It's an irrational number, very much like pi, in that if you put up 3 and square rooted in your calculator, in fact, I do have a calculator right here, and you put in 3. Let's see if we can actually see this. There it is, 3. On my screen, it's backwards, but hopefully it's not backwards on your screen, right? Yeah. So I just push the square root button, and I get 1.732050808, and that's a non-repeating, non-terminating decimal. So it's an irrational number. But the interesting thing about it is that this ratio is related to another series of, we call them dynamic ratios, like, for example, the diagonal of a square to its side, which it doesn't matter what size those circles are that you generate the vesica with. The ratio of length to width is always going to be the same. It doesn't matter what size your square is, the ratio of diagonal to side will always be the same. It'll be a constant, right? Well, it turns out that if simply using Pythagorean theorem, you can take a right triangle, and if its two sides are equal, then it's and you ascribe the value of unity to one of those sides, the diagonal will be the square root of 2. And I started out years ago. I worked many years as a carpenter, and one of the very first things I learned was the 17 to 12 rule, which, because carpenters, if they're going to lay out, and builders have done this literally, it goes back centuries, if not millennia. If you have a ruler and you measure a square and it's 12 inches on a side, the diagonal will be 16.97 something inches, which in round numbers is 17. Now, if you're building a house, the ratio of 17 to 12 is close enough to 16.97 to 12 that it does that little bit of 3/100ths of an inch doesn't matter, right? So the 1712 rule was something I learned long ago, that the diagonal of a square to its side was almost 17 to 12. But then if you want to refine it, it's 16.97. Well, okay, so now here's the thing. What they did was they had a system where you could start with a square, and I've taught this many times, but in Egypt, the basic unit of measurement was called the remen, and it was about equal to 14 point something inch of our inches. And if you were to draw a square that's one remen on a side, its diagonal will be the royal cubit, which has been known since Isaac Newton's days. He discovered it from his analysis of the dimensions of the King's Chamber and the Great Pyramid. But it's well known. The royal cubit, you can look it up, it's about, I think it's about 20.6265 inches. So taking a square that's one remen on a side, which is your basic unit, its diagonal then is the royal cubit. Now they're incommensurables, right? These numbers are incommensurable. You can have one whole remen, but you will not have a whole number of royal cubits. Or vice versa. You can ascribe a whole number, an integral value to the diagonal, but then the side of the square will be irrational. It will not have. However, when you go from one dimension into two dimensions and you're talking about area, now you get perfectly commensurable because one square royal cubit is exactly two square remens. Now, if you take a rectangle and you draw it so that, let's say you start with a rectangle and its short side is the remen and its long side is the royal cubit, its diagonal is going to be the square root of 3, the same value you get with that vesica construction. Now, there, it turns out, there was a prominent use of measure. Sometimes, according to some traditions, it was the unit of measure used to build King Solomon's temple. I don't know about that. I haven't seen proof of that, but it was alleged that that's what was used. But there was a cubit called the Palestinian cubit. And the Palestinian cubit was the square root of 3 times the remen, coincidentally. Now, the remen and the royal cubit were being used way back into the Old Kingdom, 4,500 years ago. The Palestinian cubit was being used about 1000 BC, so about 3,000 years ago. Yet they're related geometrically in that because of that same ratio, we call it the dynamic symmetry, the Palestinian cubit and the remen are incommensurable in linear, but in area, then the Palestinian cubit is exactly 3 square remen in area, which is interesting. And it goes on. This system is actually much more involved than that, but you seem to have this integration of many of the ancient units of measurement, oftentimes the ones that are associated with sacred structures. And I use this without defining what we mean by sacred structure. Obviously, we would think traditionally it's a place where people go to worship or whatever. I think we can take that to another a level and say that maybe we could discuss the possibility that ultimately what defines a sacred space or a sacred structure is the components of its design and the materials used and the geometry integral to the structure.
So let me ask a couple questions, because first, I think that from a physics perspective, the reason why sacred geometry is important is that we think we live in a 3-dimensional world. And even when we look at electromagnetism, we use the right-hand rule, which basically creates a orthogonal cube-like structure. Mm-hmm. That's how we experience our reality. And so
those are your 3 axes right there.
Yeah. So it makes sense that you would imagine that certain shapes are going to be significant in the structure of our reality and how we build stuff in our reality. And then I guess the question would be, did the ancients potentially know something about, physics or science more than we potentially give them credit for? And I guess I want to know your opinion on, before we get to that, because I do want to know more about the ancient history and technology, but do you think crop circles are connected to some of this, like sacred geometry stuff? And When you say is sacred geometry, I didn't know this. Is it because these geometries are found in sacred sites? Is that where the terminology actually comes from? And could crop circles be a
Well,
sacred site? Oh, go ahead.
well, yeah, the earliest place I can recall encountering the term sacred geometry was in a, he was his architectural historian, Freemason, and he was well versed in the studies of geometry, particularly being used throughout architecture, and he had a 2-volume set that was primarily on the geometry of churches and cathedrals in the Middle Ages, and he used the term sacred geometry throughout. So the title of the book, it's right back there on the shelf. I could go get it. We could look at it, but it was beautiful fold-outs with all of the geometries juxtaposed on not only the ground plans of cathedrals, but the elevations as well. And there was a consistent set of geometry. It involved repetitive use of the same ratios that I was just describing. And that was I've not been able to really find where it was used before that, but it's been used redundantly since then and has come to have its own meaning now and variations of meaning. I'm kind of trying to redefine it, I guess, in a way to be a little bit more scientifically specific, that there is something actually measurable and quantifiable that's going on there, rather than just, oh, yeah, I went to this space and I felt really good. And having visited a lot of spaces, I can actually attest that, yeah, there seems to be some spaces where I felt really good while I was there, and then I walked out and had this sense of energy or whatever. And, I've talked to many, many people over the decades and heard that many times. I don't know how much is objective and how much is subjective, but in my case, I'd say it's both. So then the question in my mind is, okay, is there something actually tangible that can be measured? Is there something that we can actually quantify that's happening that affects the human nervous system in some way, or your state of mind? And I think the answer is probably yes. There is some way that it does that. Now, on a very mundane level, we could say, well, there are certain ratios that seem to, embody a sense of harmony. And a big part of, when I studied ancient Greek architecture and statuary, what I kind of came upon was this idea of scale and variance, this idea the modern term is self-similarity. So that within a composition, whether it's a building, whether it's a statue, later on, paintings, there are certain relationships between the parts and the whole. They may not even be detectable or perceivable by the conscious mind, but they're somehow still affecting your perceptions of these things, because there is this relationship between the part and the whole. And then that gets us back, I think, to the word you used earlier, Ashton, which is resonance. Somehow, if you can take let's say if you're going to do a painting and you're going to incorporate sacred geometry, you determine the ratios of your canvas, and then there are certain rules and techniques by which you can divide it up so that the parts somehow will reflect the proportions of the original. And that seems to be key in many different manifestations of sacred art and architecture and things around the world, is that particular relationship. And we can see it in the relationships between the basic polygons, because the polygons will start out that you've got essentially 5 shapes that you can have all the sides the same and all the angles the same, and the simplest is the equilateral triangle. Then you get to the square, and then you get to the pentagon, and then which is a 5-sided. And then, of course, if you go to the 6-sided, you're just basically repeating. That's a repetition of equilateral triangles.
Well, so let me ask. Do you think with
go
the
ahead.
crop circle stuff, do you think people are like, that's somebody trying to send us a message? Because, I mean, whether or not you believe, wherever the crop circles are coming from, like, clearly have sacred geometry, and then people point it out all the time. Do you think that?
Oh, yes.
What's your thoughts on that whole phenomenon?
Well, my thoughts on sacred geometry, on the crop circles, are that there's studies. I could pull up, I have some of those studies right here on my I could pull up
Let's just
probably
say it's
within 20
contested,
seconds.
but yeah, the basic, I'm generally familiar with the kind of overall, like how you tell the real ones from the fake ones with the, how they've been broken or if they're just bent and
Yeah.
stuff like that, and like
Yeah.
the bending of them, which I think is really cool. So do you think though that like, aliens or another civilization are making them, or do you think they might be coming just from some enthusiast of sacred geometry?
Well, let me put it this. I would start with Occam's razor and say, okay, it's people, humans doing it. Okay, so then let's just take that apart. Let's unpack that and look at that and see what that implies. You look at some of these crop circles are incredibly complex. Mm-hmm. Now, I've been a builder. We build things, and before we build something, let's say we're going to build a house, and let's say I've built some pretty complicated houses, complicated footprints and so on. Well, the first thing you have to do is you go out and you level the site, right? The first thing you do, because if you're going to if your site's not level, it's almost impossible, very difficult to get right angle corners and get proper angles between the sides and all that. So, and even if it's not all one level, it's you step it, but each level. Okay, so you're first of all, you're looking for a level site. Okay, now you do your surveying and you lay out what you do is you use what's called batter boards, and you set up and you lay out the building. The way we do it is we'll find the corners of the building and we'll drive a stake at that point. And then in top of that wooden stake, there's a wooden stake, you put a little finish nail. That's literally only 1/16 of an inch wide. You put that finish nail in, and that'll be your first step. And then that's your datum point. Everything refers back to that. Right, and it doesn't matter you're laying out a simple square, rectangle, or into a multi-sided polygon. Doesn't matter. You start with a datum point, and everything refers back to that. Right. Now, from there, you have to. We will set. Let's say every corner, whether it's an outside corner or an inside corner, will be marked with a stake, and it will have its own little finish nail marking that exact point. Right. Then you run lines right around that. You run builder's lines are called, or mason's lines, so that now you've got string that marks out your whole pattern on the ground, right? So then if you go to excavate or to do whatever, the next thing we would do is we usually will excavate trenches that are the footings. But let's say we're going to try to do this as a crop circle. Well, here's the thing. I can go out there and we'll lay out a house. We'll go out there. We're using a transit. We're using, maybe 100, 150-foot fiberglass tape, and we'll spend the better part of a day out there laying out a fairly simple pattern on the ground, right? Now, if somebody said to me, well, here's this picture of this crop circle, and it's this amazingly complex geometry, could you go out and create this in the field? And I would say, well, I've never tried doing that before, but I could give it a shot. However, if you give me this pattern and I'm going to recreate that pattern in the field, I don't just go out there with a couple of guys and some boards and some rope in the middle of the night in the dark, and in the morning when I leave, here's this incredible pattern on the ground. No, that ain't going to happen. Give me a month, give me a couple of months, maybe, right? Yeah. Well, so what does this bring us to? I mean, the implausibility of that. Okay, so if I was going to do that and try to do it effectively, what I'd have to do is I'd have to have a warehouse somewhere. I'd have to get together a team, and we would have to lay out this like a full scale of the pattern, and then we would have to rehearse and rehearse and rehearse so everybody knew exactly what to do, because we don't have a week, we don't have 3 weeks or a month to do this. We have to do it in one night. Yep. We have to get out to the site. Nobody can see us. We can't get caught. We have to get out there in the dark, get this thing done, and get the hell out of there before the sun comes up. Right? Yeah. Now, the only way I could even begin to conceive how you would do something like that, again, is if you had a place, and, I never took part in them myself, but they used to have these contests where, trying to, build a house in one day. Yeah. So, yeah, you get a crew out there, and they build a house in a day. However, preceding that day of building that house are 3 or 4 months of practice and rehearsal over and over, your timing, your tempo, everything.
And you could say
So
like,
where
oh,
is that
well,
happening?
yeah, you could say like, oh, well, it's like a flash mob, but like, where are the videos too? We live in the TikTok age. Nobody's recording any themselves like making any of these things. You know, it's like no videos ever.
Right.
That's the part where like I'm with you, where it's I say, okay, I'm looking for a normal explanation, but like, where are these mysterious crop circle builders that go in the middle of the night and get these things up? And you know what technology they use? And it seems complicated, but to change the topic.
Let me ask.
Finish up. Go ahead.
Let me ask you. So you mentioned flash mobs, which is interesting because is that what, like somebody's saying? Oh, well, it's like a flash mob. Okay, so but here's the thing: a flash mob, like my kid was in a flash mob once upon a time, and they rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed again to get it right, and they still didn't get it right exactly. But so if you tell me, oh, it's a flash mob, okay, well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it would have to be a flash mob. But they're not going to go out there willing. Here's here's a nice pattern. We draw it on this piece of paper. Then they sneak out there at night in the dark, and the next morning there it is, perfectly recreated in the granary. No, that just doesn't make sense.
Nah, I'm with you. And there's even crazier ones that like were done in the daytime, where they can like narrow down the period of time to an hour. So I think that it might be a message. And on the same topic, or on a similar topic. Well, first of all, I want to say about scale invariance. That's a very huge point you made about scale invariance. I think that for the people out there that don't know, it just means that what is small can be made to be big. Like the thing, and it'll function and it'll act the same way. So what this means in theory is that even an atom can be scaled up to something very large. And I think the connection there is something called Bose-Einstein condensate, which is basically making atoms act coherent, super fluidic, as though they're acting as one overall structure. Now, I've read a lot or some papers about how they've been able to stabilize the plasmas, and it seems to be that they use this vortical motion as one option, and another way is like a squeezing a plasma, and that's how they can make these ball lightnings like stable, so they don't just dissipate. And
In the laboratory.
Yeah.
In the laboratory to make ball light.
Artificial,
okay.
yes, artificially
Yeah.
produced.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they figured out if they do the math, they just run the numbers. They can figure out, oh, the plasma is creating its own electromagnetic fields, and if we move the plasma around the right way, we can, cancel out these fields. And then we can, if we have this either vortical motion or squeezing type state happen, that it will do what you said in terms of the waves, and it creates a standing wave. The standing wave, so that it's perfectly inside of the field that you're trying to create.
Yes.
And this reminds me, all of what we just discussed reminds me of something called cymatics, which is sound creating just structure and shapes. And when you look at them, I don't know if you have, what are your thoughts on cymatics and the shapes that get produced at various tones? Because it then takes this idea of resonance, and you put if people aren't familiar, you put sand on like a metal sheet and they hit it with certain frequencies and these shapes form. But it's not just like a triangle. It'll be like a circle and then like kind of half circles on the outside, like very complex shape form. So do you think that's just like a combination of lower form sacred geometry shapes?
Yeah, my first guess is that we're looking at sort of a macrocosm material there that's conformal to these patterns of but all the material, whether it's sand or diatomaceous earth, whatever it is simply revealing the patterns of energy that are there, right? And even if you cleaned off the plate, the vibrations are on. Those energy patterns are still there. So I think, I absolutely. I think that you could go another level with that, and that's a very intriguing question you're asking there, Ashton, because perhaps that is the line of thinking is that the plasmas are cohering to patterns of energy that would ordinarily be invisible, but under the certain circumstances, if you bring in two vibrating systems and they're in resonance, you can have this effect at a distance, which seems to be one of the most interesting phenomena associated with that. So yeah, I think you're on the right track, and I would love to talk about that further.
Yeah, that's
I haven't experimented. I've witnessed people doing cymatics. I've never really done it myself or studied into it, so I couldn't tell you. You couldn't show me a pattern, and then I would be able to tell you, okay, this is particular frequency. But
yeah,
there are
and it's
people that
not. I
can.
think the idea is a lot of this stuff are more of just like to understand the concepts and imagine what could be. You know, it's like okay, so now I realize
Uh-huh.
we have this self-organizing property that happened, and then to your point, you're saying, well, when we're dealing with these plasmoids, it's self-organization that we're seeing. So how do we explain that? Well, we look at cymatics and we see self-organization happen at specific frequencies. We just use, general physics and waves, and we go, oh, standing waves could be what we would need for that as well. Um, and with plasma, something I don't know if you are familiar with a guy named Ken Shoulders,
Oh
but
yeah,
yeah, Ken
yes,
Shoulders,
I got introduced to him through Bendel.
yeah, and there's a lot of people who have been researching his work, and I think that his work might be the secret basis for cold fusion. Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah, I
So what he found that he could just keep the charges separated. And the question people should be asking is, if I have a plasma, and a plasma is just an amorphous blob like a gas, if I were to separate positive and negative charges, what would I think should happen? They should come back together. They should equalize. And if it's just a gas, then theoretically nothing should be stopping that from happening. Like that should just happen very quickly. But that's where Ken Shoulders comes into play. Ken Shoulders found no, for some reason these negative electron charges are clustering together. When normally you would think they should just immediately dissipate and the plasma should just neutralize. And the crazy part about this is that if you can take that effect and scale it up, now you're making like a literal like Zeus, like lightning, like that you can just strike down on a people. And especially if you can stabilize it. Now it's like, okay, well, I can just send it on somebody if I want. That to me seems kind of scary. Do you think something like that's feasible? And then do you think the universe in general, like, do you believe in electric universe or plasma universe theories?
to the extent that I understand it, it sounds like there are elements of it that are plausible, but I haven't up to this point. I have not really needed to go there. Although I get asked so often that I feel like I need to take a dive into it and really try to come away from it with some basic understanding. Absolutely, though. Hell yes, the definitely electromagnetic phenomena is key to pretty much everything. I know, though, that I think maybe where I've had some contention is I've studied into hypervelocity impacts a lot, and cratering and impact proxies that are created in the aftermath of a major hypervelocity impact. What various densities will do, what compositions will do, the difference between, let's say, an iron asteroid, a chondritic asteroid, and a comet, for example. How you can, in the field, detect the difference. So I've had people say, well, no, that is not impacts. People have not really studied what I've studied, and so they say, oh, that's not impacts. This is the electric universe. It's huge plasma bolts or lightning bolts that have created those craters. Now, I would go, okay, that's an interesting idea. It's worth looking at. There's a whole lot of coherent evidence, though, that really is consistent with hypervelocity impacts. We can look at some, I've been to Meteor Crater in Arizona now, 5 times, and, you can look at the crater morphology, width to depth, and there's, it's totally consistent with the physics of a roughly 150-foot iron asteroid. We know it was an iron asteroid because we find the pieces of it laying all over the landscape. There's a hunk of the original thing sitting in the museum there. So we have enough examples like that we can derive a lot of insight and information into the impacting process. Now, is it a matter of either or? I don't think so, because one of the things that seems to be associated oftentimes with hypervelocity impact phenomena is you get electrical discharges. It's very significant electrical discharges, particularly as this thing is passing through the atmosphere. What's the role? I don't know. But it does seem that under certain circumstances it may, and of course lightning bolts, you could describe a lightning bolt essentially as a type of organized plasma.
No,
and so yeah, so you've got this object coming might be moving at 15 to 20 miles per second, right? It's coming through the atmosphere and it looks like it's discharging plasma bolts. Yeah, that seems to me to be very plausible. I don't know if you're going to say, though, that this replaces the idea of, a dumb space rock hitting us, because one of the things I've been doing since 1988, there was a very near miss in 1988. A large asteroid came quite close. It came within the orbit of the moon, and I thought, God, that's interesting, because by that time, the ideas of hypervelocity impact were gaining more and more credibility since the hypothesis that the Cretaceous-Tertiary dinosaur era was terminated by the impact of a 6-mile asteroid. And so I'd gotten interested in that. I mean, I was one of those boys in the 50s and 60s that was obsessed with dinosaurs. I lived and breathed dinosaurs. And one of the things that even by the early 60s, even by the late 50s, there were some of the scenarios for the demise of the dinosaurs were getting dangerously catastrophic and looking at major global upheavals. So when in 1980, when the Alvarez team came out with their research associating the worldwide iridium layer with a hypervelocity impact, I found that very electrifying. And at that point, I began to get very interested in studying the phenomena of impacts. And so by the time we get to 1988, I'd had quite a time of realizing that, space isn't this empty place like we thought it was. It's densely populated. So in 1988, there was a near miss, and I started tracking those. And there have been dozens and dozens of close flybys since then. The last major one, was last June. It was estimated to be 500 to 800 feet in diameter.
Well, let me ask
and
you
it came well within.
And then you can continue on that, which is, because one thing I want to say is that the plasma universe or electric universe does not say that, it's not replacing asteroids or meteors or anything like that. I think it's a big misconception is that people think of it as like, they're trying to rewrite everything. I think it's more of just realizing that there's an electromagnetic basis to the universe, right? And you see this manifest on large scales. And then the question I really want to ask though is, do you think a space rock, a meteor or asteroid, could still take us out today? Do you think that they might have technology powerful enough to stop one secretly? They don't really talk about this recently. They used to make movies about it all the time, like in the 2000s. Just haven't really talked about it. What do you think? Since you said you've looked into it.
My first reaction would be I'd be skeptical. I mean, they spent a couple of $1 billion on the DART mission to see if we could nudge an asteroid that was on a collision trajectory with the Earth. I kind of thought at the time, and probably still would be inclined to believe that represents the state of the art. Are there technologies that, in the wings that could potentially be applied towards that in the very near future? That I would say probably so. Is anybody got it now? I would be skeptical, but show me the evidence and I'll look at it with an open mind.
But let's say though that even in the situation where, that's the thing though, is we don't even need something magical. We just need a small push, right? And to see it far enough in advance, and then even a small push is more than enough. So it's like I learned that, and tell me if you know anything different or any updates, because I'm not very well read on this. Is that only certain ones that come from I think the direction of the sun are asteroids, ones that we can't see because the sun blinds us or something like that. So those are the scary ones, but otherwise we can kind of see them. Is that what you've heard?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's certainly like the Tunguska event of 1908. That was probably a member of the Taurid meteor stream, and it had a stream. Picture it's an ellipse. It's debris. It's moving in a circle usually between Jupiter and the sun. And when it comes in, it makes a close passage by the sun called the perihelion. So if we look at the Torrid stream, our Earth's orbit intersects the Torrid stream twice. So it intersects it, and the Earth is passing through that intersection point in late June, early July, and in late October, early November. Right now, in the late October, in fact, it interestingly peaks right around Halloween. So let's say on Halloween, Earth is passing through the Torrid meteor stream. At that point, the meteors are emanating from the radiant point, it's called, out in space, which just so happens to almost bullseye on the Pleiades, which is traditionally the shoulder of the bull, Taurus. And this is why they named the Taurids. Well, that stream comes in, it goes around the sun, and then it's coming back out, and in late June, early July, the Earth crosses the stream at that point. So if you're looking in the direction of the arrival of these meteors, you're looking towards the sun. And this is why, if you read some of the eyewitness accounts of the Tunguska event of 1908, which occurred on June 30th, which is pretty much just the peak of the Torrid meteor shower, and it came from the direction of the sun, which is where the radiant point would have been at that point. So its position in the sky was consistent with the Torrids. Its time of year was consistent with being a member of the Torrid meteor stream. The eyewitness accounts are, well, you'll read things like, it looked like it was torn from the sun. It was born out of the sun. Things like that, because, and so had this thing crossed the Earth's path, let's say, in the fall around Halloween time, if we were looking upstream, we would have been looking away from the sun. So we would have seen we could have seen it coming in much sooner. But that's why, in a sense, it snuck up on us. And nobody saw it coming until literally 5, 10, 15 seconds before the thing exploded. It came in at an oblique angle to the atmosphere, and as it's moving at 12 to 15 miles per second, something like that. The atmosphere literally doesn't even have time to get out of the way, so it sort of piles up, and it becomes just like, if you dive off a high dive and you do a belly flop, you feel that impact of the water because it's not moving out of the way, right? It's kind of like that. So it exploded. It didn't hit the ground. This is important. A lot of people aren't quite clear on it. It was an aerial detonation. It did not hit the ground. Like if you go to the crater in Arizona, the famous one, which I always recommend, do it. Go there, stand on the edge of this awesome circle, this awesome bowl and hole in the ground, and realize that this is just a baby, a cosmic speck that did this, right? Well, it's interesting to contrast the meteor crater in Arizona and the Tunguska event, because meteor crater was an iron asteroid, highly dense, so it penetrates the atmosphere and hits the ground before it explodes. Tunguska is low density, hardly more dense than a piece of ice. And it's coming in, and it explodes roughly 5 miles up in the atmosphere. So you've got this pressure wave, the blast wave, radiating outward, and then it hits the ground. And when it hits the ground, it does this, and so you have, 80-some million trees over 800-some square miles flattened in a radial pattern outward from where that blast wave intersected the ground and then went radial from that point.
That was
so
like why they
those
were...
are the...
Sorry, finish your thought.
Well, yeah, those are... You can think of those as almost like endpoints of a continuum. And then you've got a whole bunch of stuff in between there that can have different effects.
Yeah. So I was going to say the destructive damage, I think that's kind of tangentially related to why they were afraid that like the atomic bomb might destroy it, take out ignite the entire atmosphere, is that they can have this massive shockwave effect and this chain effect that can happen. And when you mentioned the asteroids coming in and the reason why they detonate in the air, I think the Chernobyl one recently as well also detonated in the air.
Yes.
They actually use plasma to prevent this from happening on hypersonic crafts. So the reason why hypersonic crafts can achieve the speeds they can is they use a plasma sheath in front of them. And that's what reduces the drag and the friction, which is pretty cool. Just fun note about plasma. But something I want to go back to, it's also kind of related to sacred geometry that you mentioned, something about action at a distance and waves out of phase. It sounded very Tom Bearden-esque. And I wanted to just have you expand upon that because I've heard many people, including Terrence Howard and others, talk about phase conjugation, like waves overlapping. And I want to get your take on what it means, its significance, and applications.
Well, okay. so,
Well, yeah, okay.
well, the main thing I think is that the action at a distance.
Yeah, okay, let's do
You
that.
know,
Focus on that.
unless
That's what I
unless we
wanna
got
focus
done, we tried to talk about a particular medium of propagation, but it seems like, if you have two tuning forks and they're in resonant frequency, you can vibrate one, and assuming they're within range, the other one will vibrate
Yeah.
at the same at a same frequency or a multiple or submultiple of the base frequency. So
Okay.
what is happening there? I couldn't explain it myself. I know there's probably a physics explanation for it.
Yeah, I think the answer is just that space is not empty. That there really
Right.
is an ether, like Tesla said. There really is an ether, and what we see, there must be something else there. So there's an effect called the Aharonov-Bohm effect that
Okay.
shows that even in the absence of electromagnetic fields, there's still potentials. Like you shoot this electron past this absence of electromagnetic fields, and it gets shifted, but it shouldn't. And this opens the door to what you just said. You actually nicely explained it. That was a great analogy of using one tuning fork over here vibrating and a second tuning fork just for some reason all of a sudden getting perfectly in phase with it. And this is the concept of quantum communications. Actually, Hal Puthoff explained this on Joe Rogan earlier today, and I thought it was the best part of his conversation with Joe Rogan. He has a patent for a quantum communication system, and he said the difficult part is not sending the quantum message through the basically invisible message. It has no electromagnetic fields. The difficult part is decoding it. He said you need to have a decoder on the other side so that basically, like to your point, that the tuning fork gets in resonance. And then if you have this resonance effect happen, then you can read whatever you're sending over here, which I thought was pretty cool. So do you think that's the most important part about, phase conjugation is basically
Well, that's
quantum effect?
if I had to put my finger on something, I would say that sounds very logical to me.
Okay.
Yes, and how do you transform the frequency into something tangible? Till they work that out, I'm not ready to get into a what do you call it? What do they call it on Star Trek?
Not a holodeck.
Remember when whoever was being beamed up by Scotty?
Yeah.
What did
and
they call that
transporter?
machine on? The transporter.
The
Yeah, I'm
transporter?
not ready yet to get
Yeah.
into a transporter yet.
Yeah, not just yet. Yeah, and scaling it up, but I mean, you put the pieces together, and you have to wonder why not, because we've seen quantum teleportation. They've got like records for it
Yeah.
now, and we're sitting here saying that the universe is scale invariant. So, why can't you really scale it up from that perspective? Now, let me ask you on the ancient history side of it. Do you think ancient civilizations could have figured this idea of resonance, physics, this stuff out? I mean, they may not have had the material manufacturing that we have today, but could they still figure it out, and could they have used it? I want to know if you can think of other ways, or if you think that the one thought I had was that maybe they use sound, because maybe if everything's just based on waves, maybe sound can create like a gravity effect, and that could like reduce the weight of a block or something like that. What are your thoughts
Well-
on ways that could?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely on the right track with the idea of sound. And I remember back in the days when I still used to shave, I had an electric shaver, and I'd plug it in. If I turned it on and it was still on, and I set it down on the countertop, it started moving around. It started moving. And I remember thinking when I saw that, that's interesting. Could you use vibrations to move objects? And the answer to myself seemed, well, yeah, probably under the right circumstances you could. And then as a builder, I've had some experience moving heavy weights, heavy I-beams that weigh a ton or two. And I don't, like within my small crew that I had at the most back in the day when I was at my peak, I had 18 or 20 employees. And, we would be out there and sometimes we'd have to hoist a 1-ton I-beam up 2 stories into place. And we had we had mechanical ways of doing that. And I often thought, God, I wonder if these guys, because you see all over the world, doesn't matter, every continent virtually, we don't know about Antarctica, but every other continent has examples of megalithic stonework where we're looking at stones anywhere from like 10 to 100 tons, right? Now, we use cranes to move a 2 or 3 ton I-beam into place, right? We don't do it manually. It would be completely uneconomical. Stones, yeah, we'll use stones. I mean, a lot of times now the stones we use are mainly veneer stones. We don't build things with 10-ton stones. Why? Because it would be completely uneconomical to do it. Shipping it there, getting it there, transporting it to the site, assembling it, what type of temporary support structure would you need? How you get it into place, because obviously the greater the weight, you run into this exponential problem where in order to move something, the heavier it is, the more resources you're going to have to devote to moving it. So if you look at a modern building site, you've got a huge crane with a large boom, almost sitting off site, and that boom is moving stuff. Now, if you don't have that crane, how do you mobilize the manpower, the come-alongs, the levers that you might be using? So my point is this. It would be completely uneconomical today in the modern-day society to build things out of 10 and 20-ton stones. Yet all over the ancient world, they're doing that. And what would be uneconomical for us, I would think, would be 100 times more uneconomical for a pre-industrial civilization, and yet they're doing it. They're doing it in Egypt. They're doing it in Malta. They're doing it in Great Britain. They're doing it in India. They're doing it in South America. So if you told me that there's some civilization, some culture somewhere that for whatever reason they're obsessed with moving, they've got too much testosterone or whatever, and they're obsessed with moving 5 and 10-ton stones. Okay, sure. Yeah, with brute force. And within the prehistoric cultural models, what have they got to employ? Only brute force, right? Unless they've got some really ingenious method of pulleys and come-alongs and levers and that kind of thing, right? But even there, you're still relying ultimately on brute force. Well, it seemed to me that it just never made any sense. It doesn't add up that you would have multiple cultures all over the world apparently quarrying and moving even 40 and 50-ton stones with impunity, unless they had some type of technological means for accomplishing that. Now, within the framework of more conventional thinking, that's immediately dismissed as absurd without considering the alternative that all of this is being done by brute force is probably even more absurd than the assumption that...
Doesn't it
seem go ahead.
Like it's such a great point that all these different places across the world, they're definitely not connected. Like, it's not like they were talking to each other. It's not like Göbekli Tepe was talking to Stonehenge. They all decide they're building these huge monolithic structures with massive stone pillars somehow stacked on top of other stones.
Yeah.
Doesn't it seem like they're bragging? It's almost like they're saying, look at what we are able to do. Going out of their way to do something. There's no need to do that. Just go live in a cave. You don't need to build this massive thing out there too. So that's the other thing that I would throw out there is it almost seems like they're showing us what they can do in that. How would you interpret that?
Well, I would totally accept that, what you just said. It doesn't explain to me how they're doing it.
Yeah.
But I know myself. Look, I'm building on the site. The clients were there in the morning. The truck comes and delivers some big I-beams. and the client is there, the client leaves, and then the client comes back at the end of the day and the I-beams are in place. And they're like, oh, wow, how did you do that? Well, we have our ways. I can't disclose that to you.
You say like, oh, well,
yeah.
How did that 50-story building go up there? It's like, well, they used modern engineering. It's like, if I were to try to have to do it, I'm not going to be able to figure that out. So I think maybe it does imply that they have another method, or their methods are just simply foreign to us, and that's why we couldn't figure it out. I don't know.
Okay, so here's a possibility, and I offer this as hypothetically. Somebody's going to, of course, I offer things hypothetically, and then there's always going to be somebody who says, oh, Randall says it was this way and that way, and I'm going, no, I'm putting this forward for consideration as a possibility, right? Okay, so if we look into the mythology of many of these cultures, they have very similar themes, is that somebody or something from outside their culture. Egyptians, it's the whole pantheon of Egyptian gods. Where did they learn agriculture? Where did they learn geometry? Well, it was from these outsiders. Who are these outsiders? I don't know. But we find the same themes repeated over and over and over again, where I used to go hiking up here near where I live in North Georgia. There's a mountain up there in the southern Appalachians called Blood Mountain. And I don't think it's there anymore because I think it wore out and disintegrated. But back decades ago, there was a sign right at the trailhead. And it was a Cherokee legend, because this area up there where I go hiking used to be the occupied by the Cherokee. So they had this legend, right? And it was on the sign, and it said on Blood Mountain, they would go to Blood Mountain to communicate with or to commiserate or to encounter the Nunahai that was spelled. It translated into English, Nunahai or Nunahai. And basically they described the Nunahai as the people who could travel anywhere. And I remember seeing that and begin, well, who are they? Interesting. Then, in my readings, I come across the Anasazi, the Anunnaki, the Tuatha De Danann, and I'm looking, and this root is the same in all of these. And then you go to Sumeria, you've got the root Anu, and you have the same idea that Anu was the god that taught all this stuff to mankind. So then my question is, okay, I've spent many, many years exploring the myths of great floods and deluges. Okay, I've spent thousands of hours in the field. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of papers on the subject. And my conclusion, obviously, is that behind the myths and the stories, and whether it's Noah or Utnapishtim or Deucalion or Xisithris or Manu, the list goes on. In this, it's essentially the same thing, that there was these world-destroying floods, and in the oversimplified models of the people who believe in this, they're not looking for a naturalistic explanation. Supernatural will do the trick. Well, we don't need, God created the flood, God is omnipotent, so it's supernatural. We don't need a naturalistic explanation. But on the other hand, there is a naturalistic explanation. We can't explain how gigantic floods. And when you come to understand the scale of what's implied by a peak discharge of 500 million cubic feet per second, well, if somehow, by some quirk of fate, you were able to survive in a region that was subjected to 500 million cubic feet per second, in the aftermath, you would easily conclude that the world had been destroyed, because your regional world was gone. It was right. My point I'm getting at is this: behind the myths, there are real. We can say this unequivocally now. There are real events that we now know. Paleohydrology is a real thing, and mega-scale floods, even approaching 1 billion cubic feet per second. We can now document unequivocally that the scale of flood phenomena has occurred in large parts of the Earth's surface, right? Well, let's extrapolate from that. Okay, if we can say that behind one of the most ubiquitous myths from the world, and the flood myths are ubiquitous from every inhabited continent has myths of great floods. Okay, what's the other mythology that has come down to us that's virtually as widespread and ubiquitous as this idea of the gods? Which then brings us to the question of who or what were the gods. And if we were going to try to put that, modern scholarship, basically, that's just an artifact of the primitive mind. There's not anything real there. If there is anything real, it's the deification of somebody, some pharaoh or somebody, and that's the reality.
Sure.
Now, and so in the fundamentalist view, it's, you would say maybe substitute gods, you would substitute angels or archangels, but you also have this concept of these beings that are of some type of a transcendental nature or something that, but I don't necessarily look at it that way. I think of it this way. Again, trying to reduce it down to Occam's razor. Sure. If we were faced with a global catastrophe on the scale, our modern civilization, faced with a global catastrophe on the scale of what happened in that Pleistocene-Holocene transition, particularly that window we called the Younger Dryas. If that were to happen again today, well, I think we could say without hesitation that 10,000 years down the road, archaeologists would be hard-pressed to find evidence of our presence here, of our industrial civilization, which is pretty much the byproduct of 2 or 3 centuries of cultural evolution, right? Scientific evolution.
Yeah.
Now,
so let me ask another question on that, because I do want to keep talking about the ancient history and the reset stuff, but I got to get your opinion on another idea for what the gods could be. Aliens. Okay. Aliens. So I don't think I've heard your opinion. What is your opinion on this disclosure phenomenon out there? There was this hearing actually just today. They were talking about, I don't know, they're always talking about aliens and the crash retrievals, what have you. What's your take on all of that, coming from somebody who's, more focused on the ancient history and uncovering that side of it? Does it? I mean, I guess it feels like kind of like a controlled op to me. That's what it feels like to me. Everybody's government related, so I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I can definitely see that dimension of it, a controlled op. I can see that, and I could even see the motive for that. I mean, if you've got, DARPA or whoever is testing advanced technology, and let's let people go ahead and believe that this is aliens from Zeta Reticula or wherever, right? So that would be kind of the Occam's razor. Let's boil it down to the most fundamental thing that without going into the exotic realms or exotic explanations first. And does that make sense? I think it makes sense in a lot of the cases, but not all of the cases. I recently read Lou Elizondo.
Yeah.
Who he is.
You read his book?
Right. Yes. In fact, I think I've got it. Yeah, right here.
There's a part where he talks about the 23-minute video with orbs in a triangle formation, actually. That's very relevant to what we were talking about before. It might be plasma orbs in a equilateral triangle.
Yeah. And then, yes. Okay. So...
Well, I don't think everything they're saying is BS either. Like, I think that my opinion is it's more complicated than that, where it's more like they're telling us the truth that is not violating national security. But if you take the implications of sacred geometry and like plasma specifically, one of the things I found out from talking to U.S. Navy engineer Salvatore Pais is that theoretically we can get past the ultraviolet paradox, which ultraviolet paradox says, like, classically look at quantum mechanics and we look at waves and frequency, and if we just increase the frequency, we get more energy. But the ultraviolet paradox says, no, at some point it actually just cuts off. So you can't just increase energy to infinity. But the vibrational 0-point energy doesn't have that limitation. The structure of our universe just vibrates. So theoretically, you can just vibrate until you break the wine glass or what have you, however you want to think of it. And so what that would mean is if there are aliens and they figured out this, 0 point energy technology based on sacred geometry, they might have access to unlimited energy, like infinite energy, and we might have it too. And now, to me, I go, oh, it's really about free energy. It's not about aliens and stuff like that, And that's what I want to know, and what I want to delve into you on that thought. I want to know, first of all, if you think that's possible, and then if that is possible, what are the implications? Like, could some of I know you're big into the reset theory, and by the way, I totally agree. I think that there's been resets. Do you think that those resets, there's some possibility, or what is the possibility that they could be artificial resets? Like that it wasn't just a natural phenomenon that, somebody shot a rock at us, or, something like that as well?
Well, that's an interesting question, a loaded question, I must say.
Yeah.
But, I would tend towards thinking, that there have been numerous catastrophes now we can document that I think we could attribute to being entirely natural. Impacts, like, for example, an impact into an ocean is going to be almost 3 times more likely than an impact into land. Impact into the ocean could create tsunamis that are hundreds of feet high when they make landfall. And any kind of a coastal community, coastal civilization, unless you've got early warning technologies in place, you're toast, when that thing makes landfall. If we go back to the Ice Age with the lowered sea levels, 400 feet lower sea levels, now most of the continental shelves are exposed. During the Ice Age, that probably would have been the optimum place to try to create a community, have a settlement, would be along the coastlines, because you've got access to marine resources and you've got access to terrestrial resources. However, when you've got a 400-foot sea level rise, those coastlines are now under 400 feet of water.
Yeah.
So, and now the other thing is if, let's say, you do have even a relatively small bolide crashing into the ocean, if you've got what's going to happen is the wave propagates outwards from the impact point, as it goes into the shallows, what happens there is you've got, when it's moving into deep ocean, you've got this wave that you could think of as being, hundreds of feet deep. And then when that moves in onto the shallows, what happens is that water piles up. And so you can think of it this way, Ashton, if you've got a steep gradient at the coastline, that you'll have a run-up height, could be 200 feet high, but its run-in distance is going to be limited by the gradient of the coastline. If you've got a shallow gradient, like you would have had during the Ice Age, when all the continental shelves at the continents are exposed, now when that 200-foot wave hits, its run-in could be dozens and dozens of miles. Right, because you got the slow. You can picture that, can't you? You got the wave coming in here. It's run in before it reaches its distal point, before it reverses and flows back out. Could be many times further than if it's a steeper. So, if you had a society living on a coastline at the end of the last Ice Age, I think that it's very likely that they would be completely erased from any kind of existence. Even without a bolide impact, that rise in sea level is going to create tremendous amounts of energy that's going to be dissipated in the intertidal zone. And that energy is going to be enough to wipe out pretty much anything. I mean, we already know that the modern coastlines are degrading considerably because of sea level rise. You can see videos online where the cliffs are collapsing into the water and carrying buildings and stuff with them. Well, during the Ice Age, I think that the case for a multi-impact event is very strong. It's very robust at this point. In fact, it may have been even, I call it I maybe didn't originate this term, but an epoch, an impact epoch, where you've got the disintegrated byproducts of some larger object that the Earth encounters multiple times during that phase between initial breakup and the point at which most of the debris has now been turned to basically cosmic dust, or its most likely endpoint is going to be it falls into the sun. Ultimately, that's where, because a lot of times we're talking about Tunguska and we're talking about the perihelion passage. Well, as each passage, it'll can be drawn in closer to the sun. If you look at the Kreutz sun grazers, which is a new family of comets that have been discovered, they will orbit the sun. They'll be seeing orbit the sun, but their ultimate destiny is that they fall into the sun and they get consumed by the sun. So let's say here's a model. You've got a large comet comes into the inner solar system from the zone outside of Neptune, like the Kuiper disk, which is hypothetical, but it's almost certainly a real thing. And we won't get into why we know that based on probabilistics, but it's almost certainly a real thing. And so if a comet is delivered from the Kuiper disk into the inner solar system, it's going to lay in close to the plane of the ecliptic, which is the orbital plane of the planets. It then begins to undergo a hierarchy of disintegrations. And then it'll go through a first level disintegration, then it'll go through a second level. And each time it makes a close passage, like a perijovian passage close to Jupiter, or a close passage by the Earth, the gravity field will cause it further breakup and further disruption. The ultimate final state of it is going to be dust if it's not swept up into a planetary or the sun, right? So now it may take several millennia for that whole process to complete itself. During that millennia, if that stuff is in an ecliptic orbit, yeah, the Earth is going to be highly vulnerable to encountering the byproducts of that event, of that disintegration process. So until that material then clears out of the orbital plane, we could be vulnerable. And I think that the model now supports that. I think that, for example, at the end of the last ice age, there was a vulnerable period that maybe lasted 3,000 to 4,000 years. And ultimately, it was the breakup of a large comet whose spawn is what we now call the Taurid meteor stream that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that just wiped out a lot of people. So,
yes.
Let me ask a different question on it. Let's assume that there is this resonance-based, let's just call it Tesla-based technology, and that some ancient civilizations kind of had some form of it. Do you think it's possible that over their 1,000, 2,000 years, like humans or societies, maybe secret societies or something like that, could have kept this information and passed this information down over the years without it, like,
yes,
mainstream? You do? Can you elaborate on that?
I do.
Yeah. How do you think? And like, I guess, who do you think might have done that or what have you? Because I know there's been. I mean, honestly, I don't know much about it or what have you. And this isn't meant to attack you. I'm not trying to. I know that you're. Some people say you're a 33-degree Mason. I don't know what any of this stuff means, but I'm just curious.
Sir, I went through the Scottish Rite years ago, which is up to the 32nd degree.
Oh, okay, got it.
But I've not been active in the Scottish Rite, although I've studied pretty deeply into the symbolism.
But does this mean you're Illuminati or I don't know what? Okay, got it.
No.
You're not a reptilian,
there's so
right?
much.
Okay. Just
well, I sometimes get in a reptilian mood. I do, actually. But no, as far as I know, I'm not reptilian.
So which of the secret societies that are hiding, that could have hidden the technology then, do you think?
Oh, we could go back. We could talk about the Dionysian artificers, the Eleusinians, the Roman Collegium, the Cometines, the Martinists.
You think the
Vatican
guilds,
has some
somebody
stuff? During? Oh, I'm sure they do. Yeah, I'm sure they do. Although, I've heard interesting things that I can't prove.
Yeah.
About the Vatican Library. I know somebody who actually visited the Vatican Library and said, yes, there's an extraordinary amount of stuff there that they've preserved. Maybe someday they'll see fit to kind of begin to open the vaults a little bit. I would sure like that. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Freemasons. The Masons are sitting on a huge repository of symbolism that's basically come down from the Middle Ages. The same symbolism that was encoded into the Gothic cathedrals. It's been said that Chartres Cathedral is the golden book of the West, that it is a textbook in the ancient science. And once you begin to look at it, you begin to think that, yeah, that actually seems believable, because, we could take that as a type case where you've got a situation where you've just come out of 300 years of the so-called Dark Ages, which began like in the 500s with literal darkening, probably multiple closely spaced volcanic eruptions, literally filled the atmosphere with so much stuff that the sun wasn't coming through. I mean, that really does look real. That's not some exotic thing, fringe idea. That's a very real idea. In fact, there's many ways that we can demonstrate that. But it literally looks like there was a series of events that plunged the Earth into a 300-year period of cold weather. It caused repeated agricultural failures, which caused food shortages, which led to famine. Famines led to people being malnourished. Weak immune systems got weak, and then we see that typically, historically, pandemic diseases like the Justinian plague or the bubonic plague are associated with this decline in global temperature. The cold weather brings on agricultural failures, which then leads to hunger and so on. It's almost like dominoes, right? So, come around between 900 and 1000 AD, the things cleared up and the planet warmed. The sea ice in the North Atlantic receded way back and opened up the sea lanes between Northern Europe, Iceland, and between Iceland and Greenland. And so that's when we had the migration of Vikings, for example, all the way to Greenland and settling and producing farming agricultural colonies on Greenland, where now it's permafrost, right? So during this period, it was warm. Well, one of the consequences of that was that you had 100 to 150 years of abundant agriculture in Europe. And it means people were having enough to eat, the population grew, infant mortality declined, even the stature of European peoples increased by 3 to 4 inches on average because they were now getting well fed. So the other consequence was this enormous expansion of population. So now come to 1130. Okay, we've had a century and a half of optimum climate, abundant agricultural harvests, growing, expanding population, but people are still basically living almost a feudal existence. Feudal, not futile, a feudal existence. Yeah. Primitive agriculture. Okay. But now we get to 1130 and something very interesting happens. Construction begins on the first high Gothic cathedral, Notre Dame, at St. Denis, right? Within 10 to 20 years, you've got dozens of these massive cathedrals coming up out of the ground, right? Now, each of these cathedrals is like a quantum innovation over and above what preceded them. You look at the simple structural methodology of a Romanesque. It's completely primitive next to the high Gothic vault, the ogival vault, which literally has the stones. They came up with an innovation in the mortar, so that the mortar they used was as strong as the stones itself. So the difference between here now is you've got a structural system that's under tension in a Gothic vault. You've got this resonant chamber beneath that ogival vault. It's all pure sacred geometry. You have, because of the fact that you've got this innovation of the flying buttress. How can I explain that? Let's see if I've got something here. I'll just take this. Okay. Here's one of the arches of your vault. You maybe would have two of them. Meeting. You can picture like this, right? Yeah. So what they're going to want to do is the forces are actually. It's being held in. The flying buttress is actually providing a lateral force against the base of the vault. If you were to remove the flying buttress, the vault's going to do this. Yep. Okay, that is a very innovative engineering system. Now,
so you're saying that there had major innovations that potentially were being passed down? Is that what you're implying?
Well, then the mystery is passed down from where? Because it seems like it was born whole cloth out of nothing. There doesn't seem to be any gestation. It's just there.
Yeah.
Came out of nowhere. You could almost say that it came out of nowhere. But see, it goes further than that. In order to build one Gothic cathedral, you have to have this enormous organization of highly skilled people.
Yeah.
You have to be able to go and quarry the stones, and they have to be chosen with care. You cannot have fracture lines in the stone. The whole process, quarrying the stones, preparing the stones, the sculptural programs, the stained glass,
everything. Yeah.
Everything. It's like, well, kind of like almost going back to our metaphor of the crop circles. It's almost like you had to have the entire army in place, highly trained, ready to go. Somebody blows the whistle, and boom, it begins. And for the next 150 years, you've got 80 of these incredible structures going up. Chartres, Notre Dame, Leon, Amiens, Reims, Bourget, on and on, these incredible structures. And if you haven't put that on your bucket list to go travel over Europe and visit some of these cathedrals, and it's just mind-blowing. And then, as quick as it started, it ended.
Huh.
It ended in the late 1200s, very early 1300s, and what's interesting is that warm period came to a sudden end. And in the 1330s to 1340s, you had multiple, actually earlier than that, you had a whole series of cold years where agriculture failed. You had crops dying in the fields. You had frosts that were coming in the middle of the summer. And it took about 30 years for this declining weather to catch up. But the end result is that, you had mass starvation. And that mass starvation is what preceded the onset of the bubonic plague. And once you had the bubonic plague, it was done with, because there were places where half the population of Europe was wiped out. You didn't have the labor force anymore.
Yes,
and you didn't have the labor force in that what's called the late antiquity ice age, the late antique little ice age, which was from the 500s to the 900s. That was the dark age. Then that was followed by the warmth of the climatic optimum, the little ice age, the medieval warm period. And it's like they were ready, assembled, and they exploited this opportunity, this window of opportunity, where you had enough people. How they got them trained and ready, I don't know. That's one of the really interesting mysteries of the rise of Western civilization. But they did. And then when the climate crashed in the late 12, early 1300s, that was when the great Gothic building boom came to an end. Now, there was still sporadic building went on for hundreds of years, but not anywhere near that scale, say, between the late 11 and the early 1200s. So how do you explain that? Unless there was somebody who had a system, and they were, in effect, almost waiting until, like I know myself, when I build something, I have to have a pool of labor I can draw on. If I don't have that, I can conceive of anything, but I'm not building anything.
You want to know what's weird about that? Is that another thing about Hal Puthoff today? He was talking to Joe Rogan about, you should listen to this part, the quantum communication
I will.
part near the end of the interview. And what was weird about it was that Hal Puthoff has these patents since the 1990s that is a quantum communication patent with no electromagnetic field. And I've been wondering, well, what's the deal with this patent? He got it approved like 5 times since then. Well, he explained today what it was. Is he said at least, this is if you believe his public-facing story. He says he put it on the back burner because the material science hadn't gotten to a point yet where it could actually be put into practice. And so now you think about this and you go, So this theory then is that maybe imagine a scenario where he saw a UFO, something that was impossible for us to build, and was like, oh, I know how this is happening. We just can't build it yet. And now he's going, and now what's he doing right now? He's going back to the quantum communication thing, because now presumably our what do they call it? The manufacturing, the lithography, I think they call it lithography, making little microchips. It's getting good enough now where they can do really crazy stuff. So that does kind of present the idea of like, what if there was, a group that had this knowledge to make this plan for engineering, but didn't have the right resources to be able to put it into place. But then population gets big enough, now they go, okay, we got the people to make it happen, right?
Yeah.
It's cool.
Well, yeah, that's kind of I'm putting that out there as a hypothetical scenario, which to me explains it as well as anything, because there's really no other explanation that makes any sense.
Yeah.
You don't instantly, obviously, like the skill level that on one of my projects wouldn't be anywhere near what in the level of organization. But of course, if I build a house, I've got an entire society. We might order windows from, up in Wisconsin. We might be ordering getting tile from Italy. You know, without that, what am I doing? I'm using local stone, local timber, whatever it might be, earth. But then to be able to go from almost like working on that level to building a cathedral, that is a quantum leap in a way there, see? And I think that we could...
I think your stories, like, you've got good stories that kind of really rationalize, and that's something I've wondered is about those cathedrals. I never knew that before we talked here today. And I want to ask, let me bounce a theory that I have off you, since you're really the expert in ancient history stuff, is that I think my biggest fear for what the answer to this whole disclosure UFO alien thing would be a scenario where there is this advanced technology, and maybe we've been talking about the basis of it, frequency, energy, vibration, plasma, etc., that is just another echelon up. And the downside of it would be that if you achieve that level of technology, you would just automatically at some point wipe yourselves out. Like somebody presses the button that ends us all and wipes us all out. And the reason why this scares me is that I asked the question, why would somebody hide information? Why would you hide technology? Like, what would be the bad thing about technology? And then I just take it to its extreme and I go, oh, well, if, you look at the atom bomb and you say, well, what if we can do something that's 1,000,000 times or infinitely more powerful than that? And so my theory is, well, we maybe made a conscious decision to say, you know what, we see the writing on the wall that we're going to get to a point where it's just too dangerous. And we say, let's just make ourselves dumber. I think it was actually the show Battlestar Galactica, I think is the theory, where they just shoot their spaceships into the sun and they're like, okay, bye technology, we're going to go live on this planet. Like, I don't know, what do you think that could be something that would be?
Well, I have a sort of a romantic, growing up in a pastoral rural environment in Minnesota, I have this kind of emotional connection with living out there and close to nature. Where as a kid I could sit in we had property on a lake, I could sit in my backyard and fish. There was hunting all around. There was, farms that were growing food, and it was, so I have this sympathetic resonance for that kind of Edenic existence right in my genes, because that was sort of where I grew up. I believe we need technology because based upon what I have seen in my studies on catastrophism is that, well, let's take an example. Look at look at the great tsunami that happened in Indonesia. It was in 2003, where there was over 200,000 people killed.
Yeah, that's horrible.
And then you look, it was horrible, but there was no early warning system. There was no technology in place to tell these people what was happening. Come back a few years later, you had an equally large destructive tsunami that hit Japan, remember? But the fatalities of that were minuscule compared to the Indonesian tsunami. Why? Because there was technology in place. Yeah. So if I look at it that way, now, does technology have a dual side? Yes. I mean, obviously, you mentioned the atomic bomb. I think, let me say this, from what my understanding now of plasma technology is that if you look at the atom bomb and you look at the burning of fossil fuels, anything like that, you're looking at explosive technology where the organized matter is being torn apart. Yes. It disintegrates. Whereas in plasma technology, it seems it's the opposite. You're actually creating organized, coherent systems, and many of those seem to be integral to life processes, because we'll use the example of the so-called divine proportion, and I certainly understand why some of the geometers of the Middle Ages referred to it. Kepler referred to it as one of the great treasures of geometry, and we find it infused in all living systems. And we find it in the cosmic domain, we find it in the microcosmic domain, and we find it in the human domain, in the domain of life. I don't know why that is, other than it seems to be inherent within the geometry itself, because when you have these dynamic forms, they have this potential of infinite replicability, either in an expanding scale or a contracting scale. And in the geometry courses that I do, I show, it's hands-on. Here's how you do it. Here's how you can reproduce this particular form infinitely. Just depending on the scale that you can operate. Now in the human scale, obviously there's limitations to how big it can go and there's limitations to how small you can go. But when you go into the microscopic scale or the cosmological scale, we find the same repetitive patterns emerging on those levels. So I got plenty of examples of molecular structure in which these geometric forms. I mean, look at the DNA molecule. It's basically it's a pentagon and it's a hexagon united in a certain way. There's many examples like that. So I think that there are technologies that are life destructive and there are technologies that are life enhancing. My impression of what I've seen of the plasma technologies is that they can be much more conducive to creating an organized system, which is basically isn't that what separates a living from a non-living system, is the level of organization in it to some extent.
Well, so what I would say is this, like you mentioned the fractal nature of the universe, which I think is huge as well. And that's why I think sacred geometry is so big, is that you can take a simple shape like a triangle and you just stack it on and now you add this fractal pattern and it becomes more and more complex and you increase complexity. And if you look at plasma in outer space, they put like little grains of sand in it and it actually will form spiral galaxy shapes. It will form double helix formations just naturally in outer space as well, which, this is why I say like plasma seems to be like one of these kind of base forms of what we see in the universe. To what you said about explosions, what I would say is the way I would phrase it is an explosion is an exothermic release of energy. What we're now kind of broaching on is this idea of an endothermic event, an absorption of energy. In quantum mechanics, this would be taking your energy level, your ground state, and going lower in the energy state. And now this is what we would call, you could be considered negative energy. It's still just energy, but you're going negatively down instead of going up at a higher excited energy level. And what Salvatore Pais referred to this as would be a non-radiative energy, which would mean that if you were to look at it in a thermal, you're not going to see this white hot flash because it's not a explosion release of energy. This might be the secret to the UFO phenomenon. If they are using this plasma and there's this opposite nature that's not explosion, and this is truly my belief, is that this is what I think Ken Shoulders figured out, what I think many other people have figured out about this plasma is just like this inversion effect to it, and I think it's being kept secret for national security because it's not just gravity manipulation, it's not just it's also free energy, it's figuring out fusion, it's figuring out how to make a sun like in the palm of our hand. And so this is my last question for you, which is the question I kind of ask everybody now, is that now that we put all this together, we've got, there's this technology that's being hidden from us, sacred geometry, plasma, put it together. Maybe we've got this advanced technology that's out there. Let's assume that there's this hyper advanced technology that's out there that can mean warp drives, free energy, medical cures, potentially reversing the aging process would be a real implication. You have a choice. You can have all of that stuff, or you can keep it hidden. The thing you have to give up is I say free will, but what I mean is your privacy, your individuality. Like the only way we can contain all of that power and be a society that functions is one where we reorganize our entire society in a new way that's not based around capitalism potentially. We have no scarcity anymore. So
Hmm.
you got and anyone the technology is so dangerous that anybody could destroy the whole planet with the push of a button. So we have to make sure we're monitoring everyone all the time. So make sure that nobody does it. What would you choose? Would you take the technology and give up all those freedoms? Or would you say, you know what? I'm going to pass that technology away. I like fishing out in the lake in Minnesota, by the way. I'm also from Minnesota.
If oh, you are okay. So if that was the choice,
Yeah.
I would probably go with fishing by the lake.
You know what
If
scares
that
me?
was the choice,
Yeah.
you got to convince me though that there's not a third choice in there somewhere.
You know, here's the thing. So I don't know that there not necessarily is, but I'm just sitting here and I've seen super advanced technology. I'm convinced they've got this stuff that's out there, and I just keep asking myself why. Why are they hiding it? Right? Why hide the information? Why do this? If it could just make the world a better place. And this was another thing that Hal Puthoff said on Joe Rogan today, is that he was part of the group in the early 2000s or something under Bush, where they got sent in and were like, yep, we've got super advanced technology and aliens exist and all this stuff. So you guys are going to be the ones to figure out, like, are we ready for it? And so they write down on a list, like, all the things, like, oh, well, it'll crash the stock market because, like, all these industries will just become, like, obsolete instantly. Oh, people are going to have, like, panic attacks and, like, freak out and, like, have psychological meltdowns. And they did all this stuff. And at the end of the day, they all came up with negative numbers, like different independent groups. And so they basically decided we can't handle it. Like it's too much for us. And they also decided that, well, how do we release it without our adversaries getting it? Because also, if that technology would be so powerful, then it's Russia can't have it, China can't have, how American exceptionalism is, So for me, that would be the only reason why they really would hide it at the end of the day. It must be something so big, so dark. Like another theory would be like, oh, let's say we unlock this technology and everybody now has free energy device at their home. Well, what if the aliens or whatever, the overlords are out there that have unlimited technology themselves, they instantly detect that we've reached this level of technology. Kind of like in Star Trek when what's the thing that the moment that a civilization reaches warp drive, that's when they're like allowed to be contacted, and so like the civilization comes out. But what if the aliens come out of everywhere? They just teleport in out of everywhere and just say, oh, you guys have reached the threshold where you're too powerful now, wipe you back down now to zero. And that's where I wanted to talk to you today. I'm glad we got to talk about this because I go, ooh, that's pretty scary because you imagine, remember that you were talking about that huge asteroid event or that meteor event that was really long. Like to us, that could just be, we imagine that was just a natural event that occurred. But to a civilization that's advanced enough, that's just like flicking a rock that's like stepping on an anthill, Like, oops, I stepped on that anthill. No, it
Well,
wiped that civilization
you
apart.
know what you just said. That's interesting because, and I didn't mention it earlier, but we're not that far. I mean, we're not that far away right now from having the technology where we could redirect an asteroid
Yep.
to take out a city if we wanted. I mean, we could probably be, 20 years from now, I think we could have the technology to do that if, but, I look at basically competition, the history of competition amongst nations, what's driving, if we take religion out of the equation, I think what we're left with is most competition between nations is based upon control of resources.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's why, that's what's behind the whole Ukrainian conflict. You've got 11 to 13 trillion dollars worth of resources in eastern Ukraine. Who's going to control that? Mm-hmm. Well, if Ukraine goes NATO, the West controls it. The U.S. controls it. If the eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Donetsk regions, which are mostly ethnic Russians, if they go, rejoin Russia, which is what they want to do, then Russia basically controls those resources. And now, apparently, from what I've heard, we've just, signed some deal with Ukraine that we're going to jointly develop those resources. And that to me is, well, that just proved to me what this conflict is ultimately all about. And that doesn't really resolve the competition. But on the other hand, if we had a way of resource utilization that was, exponentially beyond, which I believe we do. I believe these technologies could basically solve the problem that's, beset us since civilization began, which is the conflict, the competition for resources and essentially space. When I say, I'm not talking about space out there, I'm talking about land space, right? Because if we look at when warfare certainly begins to show up in the record, where we see the evidence of conflict with weapons, and it's interesting that they shows up around between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. During the climatic optimum, there's very little evidence of human conflict. Why? Because for one thing, post-Ice Age, human populations had been reduced enormously, and you had a whole, getting back to the term you've used, reset. We had a reset where we suddenly had nature reset. The top of the food chain has been decapitated, basically. So now you've got this proliferation of small game, climatic optimum, 2 degrees warmer than now, abundant rainfall for 3,000, 4,000 years. This is, I would interpret, as the time of being fruitful and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. Replenish the earth, because the earth has been, destroyed, basically, during this transition phase. So now we get to 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and the climatic optimum, as it's called, gives way to the neoglacial. And what happens with the neoglacial is the world very rapidly cools off by a couple of degrees. Well, this does several things. It causes the altitude of like tree lines and agriculture to drop by about 1,000 feet, depending on topography, depending on latitude, sometimes more than that. The agricultural belt contracts enormously. You have agricultural failures in Scandinavia, in the British Isles, and now we have, and during this climatic optimum, population has been booming, right? Now suddenly we have this drastic reduction of available resources, and right there, commensurate with that, you see human conflict. If you're a community that's been living at 10,000 feet above sea level, and you're farming, and then the temperature cools off by 2 degrees, and suddenly you lose 6 weeks of growing season, and suddenly you can't even practice agriculture anymore. You have to go down to the valley. Well, there's already people living in the valley, so now you get conflict. I think what we need to be looking for is a way to create abundance where our resource base is so vast that that there's no point in having conflict anymore. I look at, as a builder, sometimes I look at things like, I visited Grand Coulee Dam and Hoover Dam many times, very impressed by the scale, the scope of that. And I'm looking at Grand Coulee Dam, this huge thing that's 500 feet high and 1.5 miles wide, the largest concrete structure in North America. And I'm thinking, we couldn't have built that in the 1800s, but we could build it in the 1930s. Why? Because we now had the industrial base and we had the labor force that we could pool. However, when the government under Franklin Roosevelt first wanted to let out contracts, there was no existing contractor in the country capable of taking on that project by themselves. So what ended up happening was you had the 3 top building firms, engineering firms, construction firms in the U.S. forming a joint, who had been competitors, forming a joint venture. And only through that collaborative approach were they able to pull this project off like they did. I think we're kind of in an analogous situation. I would personally rather do a joint venture with Russia than go to have a nuclear war or World War III with Russia, if I had the choice, right? Now, I'm I've been, I grew up, I came of age during the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, right? And even during the Vietnam War, when I was very, very critical and antithetical to what the government was doing, I was proud of our space program. I followed it, my generation followed it, and I believed that it was going to continue on at that pace, that we were going to have, an international base on the moon, that we were going to use that to explore the solar system. I saw the projections that we could conceivably get to Mars by the 1980s, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we kind of got sidelined. For one thing, Nixon shut down the Apollo program because of the Vietnam War debts. He was looking for money to pay off the Vietnam War debts. So what he did, he sidelined the whole fleet of Saturn rockets that we had built when they're still operational, right? So I'm of the mind that I would rather see, let's the U.S., Russia, and China get together and take on this extraordinary challenge of building an international base on the moon from which we can now begin to harvest the infinite resources of the solar system.
Yeah.
I would see that as being a preferable alternative to this Malthusian view of, because what's the alternative? We go down fighting over diminishing resources. We have to have all the things you were describing earlier about having controls through consumption. If we're going to control energy, we're talking about the whole chain from extraction to distribution to consumption. And every aspect, every part of that has to now be rigidly controlled. I don't think we need to go down that road. And
so I would just say on that is that you can't put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to technology. It's like
exactly
technology's going to advance no matter what. And here's the scary part is that if we do assume there is this super advanced technology, then how do we approach it? I thought you brought a good point up. Is it whoever gets it first just wipes out everybody else? That's pretty sick. We can't live like that. It's not realistic, right? So then the other option is we're going to have to figure out a way where we all work hand in hand to take this technology and go to the next level. And then the other part, and I love that you're thinking about it. I think other people should. I think this is a good thought to just end it on, let people think about is, this technology, I agree. I think this technology can end scarcity, especially when it comes to Bob Greenier. It's not even just free energy through cold fusion. It's also transmutation. So we're actually talking about Star Trek replicators being something in our future. And then what I would ask people is, what does our civilization even look like in a post-scarcity world where everybody has a Star Trek replicator? That's, I think, what our future is. So, Randall Carlson, sir, thank you so much for being on my podcast. Go ahead and shout out any projects or anything you're working on or your website or anything like that.
Sure. RandallCarlson.com. That's the simplest. What's coming up? Of course, I'll be at the Cosmic Summit in June. If you're familiar with that, and George Howard. Are you going to be there?
Yeah, heck yeah. Let's hang out.
Oh, awesome. Good. Well, we get to hang out a little bit then.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get a little bit more, dig into your Minnesota background.
Oh, heck yeah.
So we'll have a chance there. But week and a half, what is it, the 11th? I'm doing a myself and Brad Young, we've been working together for years, and we're doing a tour of the Great Bonneville Flood, which is one of the great floods in the history of the world that started in Utah near Salt Lake City, and it flowed through created the Snake River Canyon, and ultimately flowed into it's part of the Columbia watershed. And it is an epic story. And some of my previous tours, we've been looking at flood events in other areas of the country, Washington, Oregon, Montana, Idaho. This one, what we're doing is we're connecting some of there are independent studies of these various diluvial events. What I'm doing is trying to show that they're connected, that the Bonneville flood and the Missoula flood are not two distinct separate events. Oh. They're both part of a much larger event. So we're going to be doing this, and I think there's three seats left, I think the last I heard. They may have sold out by now. But yeah, we're going to convene in Salt Lake City, and then we're going to tour some amazing landscapes in Utah and Idaho. So I got that coming up, and then the Cosmic Summit. then hopefully over the summer, I'm not going to have a lot to do because I'm trying to finish this book I've been working on for 3 years now, and it's just ridiculous that it's drug out this long. But I keep getting drug away into these things. And I just got back from Sedona. I was out there, a conference headlining with Graham Hancock.
Oh, yeah.
And Graham and I have become good friends over the years. I contributed to his book, Magicians of the Gods. And there's several chapters in there about the great post-terminal ice age floods that I was able to contribute to and guide him through some of these landscapes. So,
yeah. Thank you guys both for all the work that you do. I'm a huge fan of Graham Hancock, fan of your work as well. I think that I just love the people that are doing their own work, that are pushing the boundaries, that are doing their own investigation, and then finding and challenging preconceived notions that are out there. So once again, Randall Carlson, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope we can do it again.
Sounds great.